Most people assume that medieval forests were harsher, deadlier, and more unforgiving than anything a modern survivalist might face. The tools were primitive, medical knowledge was limited, and violence was constant. Yet the historical record shows something that unsettles that assumption. Men and women branded as outlaws, fugitives from royal justice, sometimes survived for decades in forests that modern, well-equipped preppers struggled to endure for more than a few days. The difference was not toughness, gear, or luck. It was a fundamentally different relationship with landscape, society, and risk. Understanding that difference exposes a blind spot in how modern people think about survival. This is not a romantic story about lone wolves living off the land. Medieval outlaws survived because they were never truly alone, never fully cut off, and never pretending the forest was empty. Their endurance depended on social systems most modern survival thinking quietly ignores. Medieval forests were managed, inhabited spaces rather than untouched wilderness. To a modern eye, the word forest suggests isolation and raw nature. In medieval Europe, a forest was often the opposite. Royal forests in England, for example, were legal zones before they were ecological ones. They were governed spaces used for grazing animals, gathering firewood, harvesting honey, cutting turf, and seasonal agriculture. Villages existed inside or directly alongside them, and paths crisscrossed the woods from centuries of daily use. Outlaws did not disappear into pristine wilderness. They retreated into landscapes that were already mapped in human memory. They knew which clearings were used for pannage when pigs were driven into the woods in autumn, which streams were reliable year-round, and which woods were patrolled heavily by foresters. This knowledge was not learned after fleeing the law. It was acquired from childhood through labor, custom, and oral tradition. Modern preppers often enter unfamiliar terrain with maps and GPS, but without lived experience. Medieval outlaws carried no maps because they did not need them. Their survival was rooted in intimate, embodied knowledge of place. Outlaw survival depended on community ties that quietly persisted despite the law. The defining mistake in modern interpretations is imagining medieval outlaws as fully cut off from society. In reality, outlawry was a legal status, not a magical severing of human relationships. Families, former neighbors, sympathetic clergy, and even local officials often continued to provide quiet support. Court records reveal repeated fines levied against villagers for harboring or feeding outlaws. These fines exist precisely because the practice was widespread. Food was passed discreetly. Information about patrols was shared. Temporary shelter was provided during harsh weather. The forest functioned as a buffer zone between outlaw and authority, not a total separation from society. You know, modern preppers often plan for isolation as a virtue. But medieval outlaws treated isolation as a liability. Their goal was to remain partially visible to trusted networks while invisible to hostile ones. This selective connectivity is, honestly, one of the most overlooked survival advantages in history. Medieval outlaws avoided self-sufficiency as an ideology. Modern survival culture places enormous emphasis on total self-reliance, but the medieval outlaw did not. Complete self-sufficiency was neither realistic nor desirable. Hunting large game was dangerous and illegal. Farming openly was impossible. Instead, outlaws relied on a mix of small-scale foraging, opportunistic hunting, theft, barter, and gifts. So they took livestock rather than attempting to raise it. They raided storehouses rather than building long-term stockpiles. And, well, they moved constantly to avoid patterns. Their survival strategy minimized labor and exposure rather than maximizing independence. This approach actually contradicts modern prepping logic, which often overestimates how much one person or small group can sustainably produce. Medieval outlaws survived longer precisely because they did less, not more. One of the sharpest contrasts lies in expectations. Medieval outlaws did not believe their situation was temporary. Many assumed exile would last for life. Their decisions reflected long-term thinking, shaped by inevitability rather than emergency. Modern preppers frequently operate in crisis mode, even during training. Stress hormones spike, sleep degrades, and decision-making narrows. Medieval outlaws adapted to a slower psychological tempo. They avoided unnecessary conflict, accepted discomfort as routine, and focused on continuity rather than triumph. This difference really matters. Survival measured in decades actually requires emotional regulation and patience more than, constant readiness. The historical record suggests that endurance favors those who normalize hardship rather than dramatize it. Forest law, it created dangers that shaped smarter movement and concealment. Royal forest law was severe, and honestly, enforcement could be brutal. Yet this danger produced discipline rather than recklessness. Outlaws learned to read signs of patrol movement, seasonal enforcement patterns, and political shifts that affected risk levels. During times of war or royal absence, enforcement weakened. During succession crises or rebellions, priorities shifted elsewhere. Outlaws survived by aligning their movements with these rhythms. They did not rely on permanent camps. Instead, they used temporary shelters, abandoned charcoal burners' huts, or natural features that left little trace. Fire was used sparingly. Waste was dispersed. Visibility was managed carefully. Modern preppers often practice camping skills that, leave clear environmental signatures, but medieval outlaws, they refined methods that assumed active pursuit by trained trackers. Their survival methods were really shaped by intelligent adversaries, not just abstract scenarios. Violence back then was a tool of last resort, not a lifestyle. Popular culture tends to emphasize outlaw violence, but honestly, long-term survival depended on restraint. Violent encounters attracted attention, retaliation, and legal escalation. Many outlaws avoided killing whenever possible, favoring intimidation or simply flight. Records show that outlaws who survived the longest were often those who maintained reputations for predictability rather than cruelty. Communities, were more willing to assist someone perceived as dangerous, but controlled rather than someone reckless and bloodthirsty. Modern survival narratives often overemphasize armed confrontation, but medieval experience actually suggests that violence, unless it's carefully limited and socially contextualized, it just shortens survival horizons. It's tempting to conclude that medieval people were simply tougher, but honestly, that kind of misses the point. Modern environments are fragmented, legally restrictive, and technologically surveilled. Forests today are smaller, privately owned, and, heavily regulated. Social trust is lower, and informal support networks are weaker, or in some cases just non-existent. Modern preppers quite often attempt to replicate medieval-style living without, the medieval social conditions. The result is usually exhaustion, exposure, and rapid failure. The forest isn't a shared resource embedded in daily life anymore. Instead, it's a monitored space governed by laws that are really designed to exclude long-term habitation. And look, the failure isn't about personal weakness, it's a structural mismatch. The enduring lesson is not how to live off the land indefinitely. It's really about how survival depends on relationships, local knowledge, psychological pacing, and, realistic assessments of risk. Medieval outlaws survived because they understood that no one survives alone, and that landscapes are social systems as much as physical ones. Preparedness rooted only in gear and techniques ignores the deeper foundations of endurance. History shows that the most resilient strategies are those that integrate community, adaptability, and humility before complex systems. Remembering these lesser-known survival histories matters because they challenge modern assumptions. They remind us that endurance is rarely about heroism or isolation. It's actually about fitting into existing worlds without drawing attention, sustaining trust quietly, and choosing continuity over spectacle. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, where survival, warfare, and human decision-making are examined without myth, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts and share this video with others who want history that actually teaches something worth remembering.